Sign it, Mom, or you'll be out by Christmas. Those were the words my son said to me at the Thanksgiving table, right after I passed him the mashed potatoes, as if he were asking for salt instead of handing me a future without a home. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe grief had finally caught up with me in ways I couldn't control, twisting simple words into something crueler than reality. But then I looked down at the paper he had slid across the table, crisp, official, unmistakable. An eviction notice. My name at the top. My address beneath it. The house I had lived in for over 30 years. The house where I raised him. Where every wall held a memory of birthdays, scraped knees, and quiet Sunday mornings. I could feel Ashley watching me from across the table, her expression carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes that didn't belong at a family dinner. Not surprise. Not discomfort. Expectation. Like she had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold. The room felt too quiet, even with the clatter of dishes and the hum of the television in the background. No one else spoke. No one asked if I was okay. My son didn't even meet my eyes. He just sat there, shoulders slightly tense, as if he had already decided that whatever came next wasn't his responsibility anymore. I turned the paper over slowly, reading every line, every word, making sure there wasn't some mistake, some misunderstanding I could cling to. But there wasn't. It was all very clear, legal, final, and yet something didn't sit right. Not the paper, not the timing, not the way Ashley's fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass when I didn't react the way she expected. Because I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded the notice neatly and placed it beside my plate, as if it were just another piece of mail. And in that moment, as I looked at my son, the boy I had once held in my arms, the man who now couldn't even look at me, I realized something else. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't impulsive. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. For longer than I could probably imagine. And the strangest part was, I had a feeling they weren't the only ones who had been making plans. I did not remember standing up from the table, but somehow I found myself back in the kitchen, my hands resting on the edge of the counter as if I needed something solid to hold me in place. The smell of roasted turkey still lingered in the air, mixed with cinnamon and something faintly sweet, the kind of scent that used to make this house feel like home. Now it felt different, like I was standing in someone else's kitchen, surrounded by pieces of a life that no longer belonged to me. Through the doorway, I could hear Ashley laughing softly, her voice low and controlled, the way she always spoke when she thought she was being charming. Daniel responded with a quiet murmur, and for a moment, I closed my eyes, remembering a time when his voice carried warmth without effort, when he would call me from another room just to ask if I needed help with dinner. That version of him felt very far away now. I reached for the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the water run longer than necessary, watching it swirl down the drain as my thoughts began to settle into something colder, something clearer. This house was not just a place to live. It was everything I had built after my husband passed, every careful decision, every dollar saved, every repair I learned to manage on my own. I remembered the winter after he died, when the furnace broke and I sat on the living room floor with a blanket around my shoulders, reading the manual line by line because I could not afford to call someone. I remembered skipping small comforts so that Daniel could have opportunities one never did, telling myself that one day he would understand what it took to give him that life. And maybe he did understand. Maybe that was exactly why this felt so deliberate. I dried my hands slowly, listening as chairs scraped lightly against the dining room floor, the sound of plates being moved, of a meal coming to an end as if nothing had happened. When I stepped back into the room, no one looked at me right away. The paper was still there beside my plate, untouched, like it was waiting for me to claim it again. Ashley glanced up first, her smile polite, almost rehearsed. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that had not been there before. I took my seat without a word, folding my hands neatly in front of me, and for the first time that evening, I noticed something else. A small detail, something that did not fit. Because 2 days ago, I had received a phone call, and the man on the other end had not sounded surprised at all when he said my name. The call had come in the late afternoon, just as the light was beginning to fade through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the floor I had polished myself for years. I almost did not answer it. Unknown numbers had a way of bringing unwanted news, and lately, I had learned to be cautious with anything that arrived unannounced. But something made me pick up, something quiet and insistent that I could not quite explain. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of voice that carried weight without needing to raise itself. He introduced himself as Robert Hayes, and there was a brief pause, as if he expected his name to mean something to me. At first, it did not. Not until he mentioned my husband. Not until he said it in that careful, measured way people use when they are about to reopen something you have spent years trying to carry with dignity. He told me he had handled some of my husband's legal matters before he passed, that there were documents that required my attention, and that it would be best if we spoke in person. I remember gripping the edge of the armrest as he spoke, my mind moving slowly, trying to connect pieces that did not seem to fit together. Everything had been settled, or at least that was what I had been told. Daniel had assured me of that. He had sat across from me at this very table, explaining that the paperwork was straightforward, that there was nothing complicated about it, that my husband had wanted things to be simple. I had believed him, not because the explanation made perfect sense, but because trusting him had always felt easier than questioning him. Mr. Hayes did not rush me. He did not push. He simply said that sometimes certain provisions were not meant to be discussed unless circumstances changed. His words were careful, but there was something beneath them, something that made the room feel a little smaller, a little quieter. I asked him what kind of circumstances he meant, and there was another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his tone shifted just enough for me to notice. He said, "Mrs. Collins, have there been any recent developments regarding your living situation?" I remember looking around the room then, at the framed photographs, at the chair where my husband used to sit, at the walls that had held our life together for decades. I told him no, not yet, and even as I said it, I felt the weight of something approaching, something inevitable. He asked if we could meet after the holiday, and I agreed without hesitation, though I could not have explained why. Now, sitting back at the table with that folded notice resting beside my plate, I realized that the call had not been a coincidence. It had been a warning, and somehow, without knowing the details, I had already stepped into a game that my son and his wife believed they had finished before it even began. The rest of the evening moved forward as if everything were still normal, as if a single piece of paper had not quietly rewritten the boundaries of my life. Plates were cleared, leftovers were packed into containers I had labeled earlier that morning, and Ashley moved through my kitchen with a familiarity that no longer felt innocent. She opened cabinets without asking, directed Daniel with small gestures, and at one point, she even corrected where I had placed the serving dishes, as though the space had already begun to shift into something that belonged more to her than to me. I watched it all without interrupting, noticing details I might have once ignored, the way Daniel deferred to her without thinking, the way conversations paused when I entered the room, the way decisions were made in glances rather than words. It had not started tonight. That much was clear now. This had been building slowly, carefully, over months, maybe longer. I remembered the first time Ashley suggested that the house was too large for me, how she had said it with a gentle smile, as if she were concerned for my comfort rather than measuring the value of what I owned. I remembered how Daniel had begun handling more of the paperwork, offering to simplify things after his father passed, bringing forms for me to sign with explanations that sounded reasonable enough at the time. I had trusted him, not because I understood every detail, but because I believed that trust was what held a family together. Now, sitting at the edge of the table as the evening came to a close, I realized that trust had been the very thing that made this possible. Ashley approached me then. Her expression softened into something almost sympathetic, though it did not quite reach her eyes. She asked if I needed help packing over the next few weeks, her tone light, as if we were discussing a casual move rather than the dismantling of a life. Daniel stood just behind her, silent, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed somewhere just over my shoulder. I looked at both of them for a long moment, taking in the distance that had settled between us, and then I nodded once, slowly, as if I were considering their offer with care. But inside, something had already shifted. The confusion was gone. The hesitation had settled into something steadier, something sharper. Because the more I replayed the past few years in my mind, the clearer the pattern became. And the more I thought about that phone call, about the way Mr. Hayes had chosen his words so carefully, the more certain I became that this story had not been written by just one side. And if they believed I was going to walk away quietly, they had already misunderstood the one thing that mattered most. That night, after they left, the house fell into a silence that felt heavier than usual, not empty, but watchful, as if even the walls were waiting to see what I would do next. I did not turn on the television. I did not distract myself with the usual routines that once filled the quiet spaces. Instead, I sat in the living room with the eviction notice resting neatly on the coffee table, exactly where I had placed it, and I let my thoughts move slowly, carefully, over every detail I could recall. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this was not just about the house. It was about timing, about control, about the assumption that I would accept what was placed in front of me without question, just as I had done before. I stood up eventually and walked toward the hallway closet, the one where I had kept old files and documents that I had not touched in years. Inside, there were boxes labeled in my handwriting, each one a quiet record of a life built step by step, bill by bill, decision by decision. I pulled one down and carried it to the dining table, the same table where everything had shifted only hours before. As I opened it, the familiar scent of paper and time greeted me, and I began sorting through the contents, not with urgency, but with intention. There were mortgage statements, insurance policies, letters, and handwritten notes from my husband, reminders of things we had planned together, promises made in simpler times. I paused at one document in particular, a copy of the original deed from years ago, my name written clearly where it belonged. I traced it lightly with my finger, not out of sentiment, but to anchor myself in something factual, something that had not been rewritten by someone else's decisions. Then I remembered the way Daniel had insisted on handling the paperwork after his father passed, how he had framed it as a way to make things easier for me, to take the burden off my shoulders. At the time, I had been grateful. Now, I saw it differently. I saw the convenience of it, the quiet transfer of responsibility, and perhaps more than that. I gathered the documents into a neat stack and set them aside, my mind already moving ahead, connecting what I had with what I needed to understand. The call from Mr. Hayes echoed again in my memory, not as a distant concern, but as something immediate, something that now carried weight I could not ignore. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the late hour, and then back at the papers in front of me. For the first time since that dinner, I allowed myself a small, measured breath. Because whatever they believed they had secured with that piece of paper, they had overlooked something important. They had assumed I would not look back. And that was their first mistake. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of stillness that usually came with comfort, but now carried something sharper beneath it. I woke before the sun had fully risen, out of habit more than rest, and made my way to the kitchen where everything remained exactly as I had left it. The stack of documents sat neatly on the table, waiting, unchanged, as if they had been holding their place for me overnight. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down, not rushing, not hesitating, simply continuing what I had already begun. One by one, I reviewed each paper again, slower this time, paying attention not just to what was there, but to what was missing. Dates, signatures, transfers that seemed ordinary on the surface, but felt too convenient when placed in the right order. It was not a single document that raised concern. It was the pattern they formed together. I remembered signing forms Daniel had brought to me, his explanations always simple, always framed as necessary steps to keep things organized. At the time, I had trusted the process because I trusted him. Now, I saw how easily trust could be used to fill in gaps where questions should have been asked. I reached for my phone and stared at it for a moment before dialing the number Mr. Hayes had given me. He answered on the second ring, his voice just as composed as I remembered. When I told him my name, there was no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had been expecting this call. I explained, briefly, what had happened the night before, choosing my words carefully, not out of fear, but because I wanted to hear how he would respond. There was a pause on the line, not long, but deliberate, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something firmer than before. He said that what I described aligned with concerns he had been instructed to monitor, and that it would be important for me to bring any documents I had to our meeting. I asked him, directly this time, what my husband had arranged, what kind of provision would require this level of caution. Another pause followed, and then he answered in a way that told me everything without revealing too much. He He said that some protections are not designed to prevent betrayal, but to respond to it. I sat there for a moment after the call ended, letting that sentence settle into place. Outside, the early light had begun to spread across the yard, touching the edges of the house in a way that felt almost unchanged. But inside, something had shifted completely. I gathered the papers into a folder, not as someone preparing to defend herself, but as someone who finally understood that the truth had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer trying to understand what they had done. I was beginning to understand what had already been done for me. I did not rush to meet him the same day, even though part of me wanted answers immediately, the kind that would settle everything into clear lines and firm conclusions. Instead, I gave it a day, just enough time to let everything settle into place, to make sure that when I walked into that office, I would not be carrying confusion with me. The drive across town felt familiar in a distant way, streets I had traveled for years now passing by like scenes from a life I was quietly stepping away from. When I arrived, the building itself was understated, nothing extravagant, just clean lines and a quiet sense of order. Inside, the receptionist greeted me by name before I even had a chance to introduce myself, which told me more than any explanation could have. Mr. Hayes was already expecting me. He stood when I entered his office, extending his hand with a calm professionalism that did not feel rehearsed. There was no unnecessary sympathy in his expression, no attempt to soften the situation. Just acknowledgement. Respect. He gestured for me to sit, and I placed the folder on his desk, sliding it toward him without a word. He opened it carefully, reviewing each document with a focus that felt deliberate, not rushed, not casual. The silence in the room was not uncomfortable. It was precise. After a few moments, he set the papers down and looked at me, not with surprise, but with confirmation. He said that what I had brought aligned with the structure he had been instructed to safeguard. I asked him then, directly, what my husband had done, what kind of arrangement required this level of quiet oversight. Mr. Hayes leaned back slightly, folding his hands in a way that suggested he had had this conversation before, perhaps not with me, but with someone who had anticipated this exact moment. He explained that my husband had created a conditional protection within his estate, one that would remain inactive unless certain actions were taken against me. Not disagreements, not misunderstandings, but deliberate attempts to remove me from my rightful position. He paused, letting that settle, then added that any such action would trigger a reassignment of control, one that could not be reversed once initiated. I listened without interrupting, each word fitting into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I asked him if the eviction notice would qualify, and he did not hesitate. He said yes. Not just qualify, activate. The room felt very still in that moment. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just settled, like something long prepared had finally been set into motion. He reached into his desk and placed a sealed envelope in front of me, its weight far greater than the paper itself. He told me it was not for me to open. It was for them. And as I looked at it, resting there between us, I understood something with complete certainty. They believed they had taken control of the situation. They had no idea they had already lost it. I carried the envelope home in my purse, not tucked away or hidden, but placed exactly where I could feel its presence with every step I took, a quiet reminder that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The house greeted me the same way it always had, still and familiar, but I moved through it differently now, noticing details with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. The light through the windows, the sound of my footsteps against the floor, the faint creak near the hallway that my husband used to joke about fixing and never did. Everything was the same, and yet nothing felt untouched. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, looking at it without reaching for it, understanding that its power did not come from what I knew, but from what they did not. That evening, Daniel called. His voice carried a careful neutrality, the kind people use when they believe they are being reasonable. He asked if I had given any thought to the timeline, to when I might begin packing, to whether I needed help arranging things. Ashley's voice drifted, faintly in the background, not loud enough to make out words, but present enough to shape his tone. I listened without interrupting, letting him finish, and when he did, I told him that I would need a few days to organize everything properly. I kept my voice calm, steady, exactly as he expected it to be. There was a brief pause on the line, and then he agreed, almost relieved, as if my compliance confirmed something he had already decided about me. When the call ended, I placed the phone down gently and turned back to the envelope. Over the next 2 days, I moved through the house with quiet intention, opening drawers, sorting through belongings, not as someone preparing to leave, but as someone deciding what mattered enough to take and what could be left behind without regret. I packed slowly, deliberately, choosing only what I needed, leaving everything else in place, untouched, as if I were preserving the illusion they believed in. On the 3rd day, I called Daniel and told him I was ready to finalize everything. Ashley answered this time, her voice bright, almost eager, and she suggested we meet that evening, said it would be easier to handle everything at once. I agreed without hesitation. When I ended the call, I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, feeling its weight settle into my hand. Then I placed it neatly inside my bag, alongside the documents I had already prepared, because if they were ready to take what they believed was theirs, then it was time for them to understand exactly what they had asked for. I arrived a few minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to walk into that room on my own terms, without being rushed or directed. The house looked the same from the outside, quiet, well-kept, the porch light casting a soft glow that once felt welcoming. Now it felt staged, like a setting prepared for a moment they had already rehearsed in their minds. When I stepped inside, Ashley greeted me first, her smile wide, almost relieved, as if everything was finally falling into place. Daniel stood behind her, hands loosely at his sides, his posture trying to appear casual but failing to hide the tension beneath it. The dining table had been cleared, replaced with a neat arrangement of papers, folders, and a pen placed carefully at the center, positioned for me. It was all very organized, very deliberate. I took a seat without comment, placing my bag beside my chair, and glanced briefly at the documents in front of me without reaching for them. Ashley began speaking almost immediately, her tone light but purposeful, explaining that everything had been prepared to make the transition smooth, that once I signed, the process would be finalized without complications. Daniel nodded along, adding small reassurances, phrases that sounded practiced, as though they had gone over them more than once. I listened quietly, letting them finish, noticing the way Ashley's eyes flickered between my face and the papers, measuring my reaction, waiting for hesitation that never came. When they were done, the room fell into a brief silence, the kind that usually invites questions. I did not ask any. Instead, I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and placed the sealed envelope on the table between us. It did not make a sound when it touched the surface, but it shifted the atmosphere immediately. Ashley's expression changed first, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that she tried to smooth over. Daniel looked at the envelope, then at me, his brow furrowing as if trying to place something he could not quite recall. I folded my hands neatly in front of me and met his gaze for the first time since that night, holding it steady, calm, without accusation or explanation. I told him that before we proceeded, there was something he needed to review. My voice was even, measured, exactly as it had been every step of the way. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel reached forward, hesitating just slightly before picking up the envelope, his fingers brushing against its edge as if testing its weight. Ashley leaned in closer, her attention fixed entirely on what he was about to open. And as I watched them, I realized something with absolute clarity. This was the first moment they were no longer in control, even if they did not know it yet. Daniel opened the envelope slowly, not out of caution, but because something in the room had shifted just enough to make him hesitate. The paper inside slid out with a soft, almost weightless motion, but the moment his eyes reached the first line, everything about him changed. It was not dramatic, not at first, just a subtle tightening in his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes as he read more carefully, as if the words in front of him refused to match what he expected to see. Ashley leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as she tried to follow along, her expression still composed but no longer confident. I said nothing. I did not need to. The silence did the work for me. Daniel read through the first page, then the second, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as though he were searching for something that would undo what he was seeing. When he finally looked up at me, there was confusion there, but also something else. Recognition, not of the document itself, but of the mistake he had made. Ashley reached for the papers then, her fingers quick, almost impatient, pulling them from his hands before he could respond. She scanned the page rapidly, her eyes moving faster than his had, but her reaction came sooner. Her posture stiffened, her lips pressing together as the meaning settled in. I could see it clearly now, the moment understanding replaced certainty. The document was not complicated. It did not need to be. It stated, in precise legal language, that any attempt to remove me from my residence, to force a transfer of ownership, or to diminish my control over the estate would immediately trigger a full reassessment of all assets. Not partial, not negotiable, complete. And in that reassessment, control would revert entirely, permanently, and without appeal. Daniel's voice came first, low, uncertain, as he tried to form a question that would make sense of what he had just read. He asked what this meant, though the answer was already in front of him. Ashley interrupted before I could respond, her tone sharper now, more urgent, insisting there had to be some kind of mistake, that this was not what had been explained to them. I watched them both, calm, steady, letting their words fill the space without interruption. When they finally fell silent, I spoke, not to argue, not to explain, but simply to clarify. I told them that the document had been prepared years ago, that it had been waiting for a moment like this, and that by handing me that notice, they had already set everything in motion. Daniel's face went pale, not from shock alone, but from the realization that there was no step backward from this point. Ashley looked between us, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the calculation underneath, searching for a way to recover control that was no longer hers to claim. And as I sat there, watching them come to terms with something they had never considered, I understood that the outcome had never depended on what I would do. It had depended entirely on what they had already chosen to do themselves. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt exposed, like something carefully hidden had been pulled into the light and could not be pushed back into place. Daniel stood there with the document still in his hand, but he was no longer reading it. He was staring at the table, his thoughts catching up to a reality he had not prepared for. Ashley was the first to recover, though not completely. She straightened slightly, her voice regaining some of its control, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. She said there must be some way to fix this, that documents could be amended, that misunderstandings could be clarified. Her words came quickly, one after another, as if speed alone could change the direction things had taken. Daniel looked at her, then back at me, his expression shifting from confusion to something more unsettled, something closer to doubt. Not about the document, but about everything that had led him here. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in front of me, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. There was nothing I needed to add. The truth had already done what it was meant to do. Ashley stepped closer to the table, placing both hands against its surface as she leaned in slightly, her voice lowering as she tried a different approach, softer now, more persuasive. She said they had only been trying to help, that the house was too much for me, that this was supposed to be a practical decision, not something personal. I met her gaze without reacting, letting her words settle and fall away on their own. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, asking if there was a way to stop what had been triggered. The question lingered in the air, not because it needed an answer, but because he already knew it would not have the one he wanted. I told him, simply, that some decisions cannot be undone once they are made. No accusation, no emphasis, just the truth, stated plainly. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck, a gesture I had seen since he was a boy, one he used when he realized he had gone too far to step back easily. Ashley turned to him then, her composure slipping just enough to reveal frustration, her voice sharper as she insisted they should not accept this, that there had to be options, alternatives, something they had not considered. But Daniel did not respond the way she expected. He did not argue. He did not agree. He simply stood there, caught between what he had done and what it had cost him. And as I watched them, I understood that this was the moment everything shifted completely, not because of what I had said, but because of what they could no longer ignore. I did not stay much longer after that, not because I was forced to leave, but because there was nothing left for me to prove. The papers remained on the table, untouched now, their purpose already fulfilled without a single signature from me. I stood up slowly, the same way I had done countless times in this house. But this time, the movement felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but complete. Daniel looked at me as I reached for my bag. His expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but something quieter, something that carried the weight of realization. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, perhaps to explain, perhaps to undo what could not be undone, but no words came. Ashley remained where she was, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the documents as if staring long enough might change what they said. I did not address either of them directly. There was no need. Some conversations end not with answers, but with understanding. As I walked toward the door, I paused briefly, letting my hand rest against the frame, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingers. This house had been more than walls and rooms. It had been a life, a place where I had built something steady, something enduring, even after loss had tried to take that from me. And for a moment, I allowed myself to remember it that way, not as something taken, but as something completed. When I stepped outside, the evening air was cool, carrying the quiet sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. I did not look back, not because I was angry, and not because I was hurt, but because I no longer needed to measure what I had lost against what I still had. Some things are not defined by ownership, and some endings are not defined by defeat. As I walked down the path, I thought about the years behind me, the choices I had made, the trust one had given, and the strength it had taken to stand where I was now without raising my voice, without demanding anything in return. There was a certain clarity in that, a kind of peace that does not come from winning, but from no longer needing to. Behind me, I could hear the faint murmur of voices through the door, low and uncertain, the sound of two people trying to understand a consequence they had never imagined for themselves. But their understanding was no longer mine to carry. I reached my car, placed my bag on the passenger seat, and paused for just a second before starting the engine. Not to hesitate, but to acknowledge what had just passed. Then I drove away, steady and unhurried, leaving behind a place that had once been my home, and carrying with me something far more lasting than anything they had tried to take. Because in the end, they believed they were taking my home. What they never understood was that I had been the one holding everything together all along.